So I'd now like to move to introducing our last speakers for today. So we have Sophie and Kristian. Sophie is the V&A Museum of Childhood's exhibition manager, who spent 7 years working on extensive temporary displays, exhibitions, installations and tours, specialising in interpretation for family audience. And she's one of the V&A's green champions and has recently become the environment rep for Prospect. And Kristian is a project curator at the V&A, focusing on contemporary design, digital, pop culture and fashion, currently working on the redevelopment of the Museum of Childhood and previously co-curator of their groundbreaking 2018 exhibition, Video Games, Design, Play and Disrupt, and has also been part of the original Rapid Response collecting team. Sophie and Kristian join us this afternoon to explore how museums can help encourage children and families to think about these environmental issues that we know are so close to their hearts. So I'd like to now hand over to them for our last talk today. Thank you.
Hi, so my name is Kristian Volsing and I am here to present about our project looking at Extinction Rebellion in the Museum of Childhood alongside my colleague Sophie Sage. Here we are. So I'm just going to introduce myself a little bit, but it's already been, we've kind of already passed that stage already, but really basically I'm coming to work in the Museum of Childhood to help with the redevelopment as a curator. Prior to working in the Museum of Childhood, I was one of the curators of Video Games, Design, Play, Disrupt at the V&A, and previous to that I worked with the Design, Architecture and Digital Department, one of the teams originating Rapid Response Collecting, which this project kind of has some relation to some extent also. And I don't know if Sophie wants to introduce herself.
Yeah,
she is.
So exhibitions manager, and in the last few years, a lot of the exhibitions that we've been working on have had a sort of sustainability strand running through them. We've got some projects in the pipeline as well that we're thinking about for talking to children around the climate crisis.
So I wanted to start with a bit of an introduction about the Museum of Childhood for those of you who may be not exactly aware of what we do here in East London. So there's the building as it is now from the outside and in the inside, and it opened originally as an offshoot of the South Kensington Museum in Bethnal Green in 1872. So we're nearly 150 years old. Starting originally with exhibits relating to industry, the local area, manufacturing, and eventually some private art collections were shown there too. An education program began for children around 1922, and this kind of influenced the direction of the collection that was built into the museum. And we officially became the Museum of Childhood in 1974. The focus was on a social history of childhood and products designed for children. And we've got a really strong local reputation for engaging children with art and design-based activities, and an international reputation for our childhood collections, which are really strong, particularly in dress and toys. But we're now going for a period of radical change. So over the last few years, the curatorial exhibitions and learning teams have all been working together to develop new ways of engaging with the collections in a redeveloped museum, and not just the Museum of Childhood collections, but bringing collections from across the whole of the museum together in one, from the V&A itself together in one space. And these images are some recent renders of a couple of our galleries focusing on inspiring imagination and design and compelling children to think creatively and to take an interest in design, the subject being somewhat maligned in current education. And our new galleries and direction dictate that we'll be engaging with the issues that affect children today, and that children can be inspired to change themselves. And the aim is to show children using the entirety of the V&A's collections that through imagination and design they can change their worlds now and in the future. And a major part of this rethink has taken place in conjunction with our young audiences. So we want our child visitors to see our museum, the child visitors to our museum, to see and hear the voices of other young people as we redevelop to become fit for the 21st century, to advocate for and to inspiring children interested in art and design and creativity as a means of changing their world. And listening to them, you know, this leads to the question, why do we choose to create a display about climate change for our family audience? Well, you can see in these two images, the photograph shows work by our design team and the curators of the redevelopment project in a co-design session to get input from our children's forum, which consists of several groups from local schools working together to reconfigure how the museum could more represent them and be more appealing to them. And there's also been co-curation sessions, finding out what issues and interests our audiences would like us to see addressed in the museum. And the Children's Forum have really expressed their desire for us to talk about the climate crisis. And this illustration is from a session that we held where we wanted to talk about world issues. So the climate crisis came up a lot within that. And we know that children have grave concerns about the future of the planet, expressed to us in sessions such as these, but also, you know, in the current situation that we're in with this generation experiencing a worldwide pandemic. And another reason for thinking about why we did this project is, you know, in my role as a project curator here at the Museum of Childhood, I joined a team to kind of change thinking about what the museum should be collecting and presenting to reflect contemporary issues in childhood. So this image here of Greta Thunberg speaking at a recent Extinction Rebellion event. She is one of the most famous children in the world to engage with climate issues. Here, actually, this was a UK climate strike, Youth for Climate Action, in February this year, actually. And as you can see from the subtitle there, she's saying, "We will not be silenced because we are the change, and change is coming, whether you like it or not." And that ended up being the kind of main name for our display. And this is a young person that inspires our audiences, children and adults alike, to act and speaks to the audiences we're trying to engage with our museum. Having started her climate strike in school at the age of 15 and becoming an international leader in this issue, she really is, you know, she really speaks to the audiences that we're trying to engage with. I wanted to bring in something to do with Greta Thunberg into the new galleries in some capacity. And as mentioned before, in my previous role, I'd worked with the Design, Architecture and Digital Department, which had a department of the V&A that has a strong remit to engage with issues of the day, where design has a handle in making a change. So alongside the children's climate strikes, the Extinction Rebellion movement was growing at this point, in part inspired by and working alongside Thunberg. And it was a movement with a really strong design-led direction, as you can see from these headlines taken from different media outlets, from the New Statesman, from Creative Review, and from Frieze magazine. And I worked with the team of the Museum of Childhood, and we joined forces with the Design, Architecture and Digital Department at the V&A to think about what kind of material we could collect from this moment that would reflect this movement, but also speak to the child audience that we have coming to our museum particularly. So I wanted to help children understand this movement, which is highly visible in the world, also being targeted critically, and to find a way of considering this movement for an audience whose engagement with objects is highly visual and tactile rather than language-led. And so we wanted to explore a bit more widely the iconic Extinction Rebellion Sandtimer logo, as we're aware that research into branding and advertising is something that children really respond to. So this is just for comparison, working with the Rapid Response Collecting team who produces this display produced for an adult audience. This is the material that they collected, and in a sense, it's more about contextualizing Extinction Rebellion the graphic design as part of a series of other design stories about design and public life, and focus highly on individual objects out of the original context that they were shown in. By comparison, at the Museum of Childhood, we collected material connected to and created by children of who had attended events with the Extinction Rebellion Families Network. And we gave them much more presence in the Museum of Childhood galleries through creating more enticing, enveloping display, but still using the language of Extinction Rebellion graphic design and protest. And while we, you know, some of the things that we had to consider when we produce this display, which is, you know, what, like curating for a family audience, what is it that we want to say, and what are the messages that are appropriate for our young audience? How do we make that content accessible? And what are the objects that we can use to tell our story? And how later, when the exhibition is open, can programming be used to support our display? So here are just some of the thoughts that we wanted the display to address. So how is design used to share ideas? We wanted to introduce children and families to simple design principles, color, contrast, repeated patterns. How can design give a voice to those who might not normally be heard? So empowering young people to think about issues that are important to them and how they might use design to address these. And in this case, the idea was that when protesters use the same colors, illustrations, and phrases, the shared messages and voices are amplified. And through harnessing their creativity and working together with others, young people too can make their own voices heard. And how might young people affect change? So for me, this was thinking about Greta Thunberg and the huge effect she's had on the climate change movement and how that can inspire visitors. And how can I make a difference specifically? So introducing the simple craft methods that Extinction Rebellion groups employ to amplify their artwork and that are regularly available to children, such as printmaking. And so here's a close-up of some of the objects that we collected and put on display. So there was a high-vis vest, something that was very familiar to children from wearing them when they go on school trips. This was adorned with a fabric patch printed using a homemade stamp with the Extinction logo at an Extinction Rebellion Families event. And also a child-sized protest placard, also produced at an Extinction Rebellion Families event, playing on one of XR's slogans, which is tell the truth. But this one particularly was aimed at children's teachers, which I thought was quite fun. And instead it says teach the truth, and it shows you how the print physically made what was on the protest placard. And just a quick note on working with what is quite a controversial group. So it's a difficult topic for us to engage with, but we didn't get quite as many complaints as you might have expected, considering the level of haranguing the group receives in the press. But we did still get complaints that we are indoctrinating children. So we were quite clear that our focus with the display, definitely in the interpretation as part, the text and how we put stuff together, was about the success of the design story and empowering children through non-violent protest, rather than telling children that they should be joining the group. And we were showing our audiences how graphic design has been used to galvanize public concern for the planet. And we were very strong on the line that's firmly in line with the V&A's mission to encourage debate and discussion about topical issues. And likewise in the Museum of Childhood, where we're trying to develop these ideas for our new audiences. So alongside the display, we also worked with our learning team to produce a public engagement program. And on that point, I'm going to hand over to Sophie now, who's going to I'll stop sharing my screen.
Hi. So for the programming, we actually worked with Extinction Rebellion themselves, and they helped us to run workshops that used printing, and they came in and actually worked with the children themselves. We didn't just want to talk to children about the stuff in the display, but wanted to give them an opportunity to actually give it a go. The programming was also sustainable, so we asked families to bring in old t-shirts and sheets and bags so that we didn't use any new material. The image on the right actually shows another event that we held where we asked family groups to create placards talking about things that were important to them. This culminated in a mini protest that was held around the museum, and we had children marching and singing about all the topics that were close to their heart. So now I'm mostly going to talk about some of the sort of practical things. The most important thing for us for this display practically was making sure that everything was sustainable. So everything in the display was either reused, recycled, or recyclable. With the graphics, the simple design principles were actually inspired by Extinction Rebellion. The content is designed to be put up in windows and on the street, so it is quite easy for us to adapt this for an exhibition purpose. So all of the paper that you can see on the wall was all recycled. So we had some old newsprint in stock from an activity that we used to run. And we printed everything on office printers and then pasted it to the walls, much like the Extinction Rebellion members do for their posters. All of the object labels were actually printed in-house and then pasted onto offcuts of plywood that we had in our workshop from previous projects. What I would say is that making a display sustainable does mean a little more work. For example, with the paper, I actually had to cut down every sheet to A3 size to fit it in the printer, and we needed quite a lot of sheets, as you can see. The object labels actually ended up looking a bit bumpy, wonky, and to be honest, a little bit homemade, but it was all done in the right spirit. I don't think it makes sense for an organisation to spend money on people, products, materials they don't need just in order to achieve a professional aesthetic. We actually wanted to set an example to visitors and other museums that it doesn't have to be perfect, especially when you're aiming to be responsive and work within a set of sustainable principles. The graphic backdrop, you can see in the image on the right, it created a backdrop of the case, and we recreated the photograph on the left. It was one of our more ambitious goals. It was the only thing that we produced externally and the only part of the project that actually cost us any money. I don't mind telling you now that the whole display cost us less than £400. We were very lucky to have a lot of these resources in stock, such as the paper. We had cases in stock, but it can be done on a budget. In order for us to create this backdrop, we actually contacted a print company and asked them to print this image, but only using materials that were going to be thrown away or were offcuts. And thankfully, they sort of rose to the challenge. We ended up using 4 different materials that they had lying around in their workshop. Each material was a different size and shape and thickness. So we had to create a sort of layered jigsaw that then built up the entire picture. This diagram shows sort of what it looked like. The green shape was Fomex, the orange shape was white Corex, the yellow was a piece of plywood that had a series of square holes cut out of it, and the blue square was a layer of clear corrugated plastic. It wasn't the neatest thing that I've ever printed, but I think in its messiness there was a message, and it was very clear to visitors that we were trying to use what we had around us. And actually I think it worked better that it was neat and put together, because it really showed people that we were trying to reuse and trying to practice what we were preaching. With the objects, so when it came to objects and mounting, we wanted to try and avoid using perspex mounts. We have a lot of them in stock, so it would have been reusing it, but we kind of wanted a plastic-free space. For the mounts, this meant being slightly creative. You can see some of our sketches around some initial ideas, but we wanted to still use material that we had in stock. We ended up using softwood to create crude structures that held the waistcoats and the flags in place. We worked with conservation to get the right shape and coated the wood in dacrylate to make sure it was conservationally sound. And what this made me realize is that mounts don't need to be fancy to do their job. A lot of the time museums want their mounts to disappear, but we used ours to support the design and again make a statement. The softwood structures that we created, I thought, were actually reminiscent of placards in protests, and were also very easy to create in-house and reuse and recycle. So before we go on to questions, I just thought I'd finish with some sort of final thoughts and sort of questions around the current situation as well. So what I would say is think about institutional priorities, especially when it comes to aesthetic versus environmentally friendly. I'm not saying that sustainable exhibitions have to be ugly, but we are all working with limited resources, and we might have to make strategic decisions about where those resources are used. Use what you have around you. Our display ended up looking the way it did because that's what we had. So be creative, take risks, and try to utilize what's in stock. And be responsive. Build time into your program to be responsive. I know, we all know how long it takes to put on exhibitions and displays. So marking out time in your program to look at contemporary stories can really help. This display took us 2 to 3 months from start to finish. So it was really rapid, very hard work, but ultimately worth it. And then finally, when we were submitting this paper, coronavirus didn't exist. And writing up my notes over the past few weeks has got me thinking about how the virus might impact future sustainability work within museums. I think in a post-COVID world, we might not have found it as easy to source loans. In the display, we had a seating area for people to read books. I don't know how that might work now. Would we have been able to do any of the associated programming? Would our little protest have taken place? So I thought I'd end with a few thoughts, reflections, and questions for you to consider. Do our visitors feel that the climate crisis is now not the most important and dangerous thing facing humanity? How will COVID affect the content of museum spaces and activities? And then, has COVID-19 blinded us to all other problems? And what is the impact of this virus on the Earth and its population if museums don't take the opportunity to explore the climate change now.
Thank you, Sophie and Kristian. That was a really great way to end the first day of our conference. I think it was the relevance of climate change to younger audiences is recognised, and I think sort of what you've just conveyed is how important it is that we consider how to engage that audience, but also really impressed with how you still didn't actually shy away from some of those really challenging issues connected with it. I also felt it came across that during this process, working with that younger audience potentially inspired some learning for you and your team. And I suppose as we move into some questions, I suppose what I wanted to know is maybe what you would take away as the most surprising thing that the children taught you during this process.
I was actually quite surprised at how young the children were that engaged with this subject matter. You know, Greta Thunberg is a teenager, and actually a lot of the teenagers we work with are very clued up. They know what they're talking about. But some of the children that visited, that came to the programming, you know, they were 3, 4, 5, you know, very, very young. And I think, you know, they have parents that support this thinking and learning at home. But it was actually really positive for us as a museum that work with children from essentially birth to find that people were really clued up from a young age, and responsive as well.
Yeah, I mean, I just wanted to say the same thing, really. It's really surprising how you know, this group was really recognizable to so many children that came to the museum, that they recognized the logo, they knew who Extinction Rebellion were and what they stood for. And, you know, I mean, as a curator in this space, it seems really positive to me, but you know, it's still yeah, I mean, it's interesting, the reactions when a lot of the press are very negative towards them.
Yeah, that's interesting, thank you. And we've had a couple of questions come through. One was around your visitor figures. I don't know if you've got this to hand, but there's an interest in sort of how the visitor numbers have been, and also whether you know that you've attracted new audiences because of the subject matter.
So this display was a free display, so there was no way of us tracking people that visited it directly. Before the museum closed, we're still closed, we got about 400,000 a year, but yeah, there's no way of knowing who saw it and who didn't. We don't know if we attracted new audiences, but what we do know is that the events that we ran, and it was during October half term last year, were received really positively and sold out. So we had a full house of people doing them, although we don't have any sort of real data around new visitors.
And in terms of your audience, the fact you were working with you know, significantly younger children than maybe normal, there's been a question about the role that social media played in terms of the exhibition and I suppose the messaging and content around it.
We didn't really engage with social media much. For us, our social media audience are adults and parents. So we're talking to different people when we use social media. I think when the V&A announced that they were acquiring Extinction Rebellion objects, there was some talk on social media, a lot of it positive and a lot of it negative, but that affected the Museum of Childhood less. I think I would say it was 95% positive, both online and in the flesh.
I mean, I also think it's really interesting to see how the social media output. We have a team as part of the V&A that produces the V&A's social media for us, and how actually over the lockdown period, how much more they've tried to engage our audiences with activities, I think. And I think, you know, it would be really good to learn from that, thinking about displays like this going forward, and even in the most simple terms of getting children to do some kind of activities at home related to the kind of material they've collected.
Sure, thank you. Just one last question before we close was, someone wanted to know what your next exhibition will be, and what you would definitely do again based on the experience of this project.
Our next exhibition, the museum's now closed for redevelopment, so we're talking about a date so far in the future that we don't have a next exhibition yet. Sorry.
No, because we also did a call out during the pandemic in conjunction with South Kensington to collect children's rainbows that were produced across the country. So we are working on somehow doing something with those, probably at South Kensington, but we're like, watch this space.
Brilliant. Well, thank you both very much. It was a really great way to finish the first day, and there was some really thought-provoking content.